majority of the church has bought into some of those ideas. So there's what's called theistic evolution within the church, trying to put together evolution with a biblical concept of God as creator. There's also the concept of a local flood, because theologians were intimidated with the geological data, thinking that there was no evidence for a Genesis flood. So somehow we have to explain the biblical account, and maybe one way is the flood was local, only took place in Mesopotamia and was not worldwide. Now, we know that the science tells us that there's plenty of evidence, in fact, overwhelming evidence of a worldwide flood. But it persists within the church, and as a result, most of the Christians that you will know of, outside of perhaps your more conservative Bible teaching churches, will hold to those viewpoints. So it's good that you are able to go to the book of Genesis and say, you can't put together evolution. It just doesn't work in Genesis chapter 1. You have to play all kinds of gymnastics, jumping through hoops to try to make it work. And the science doesn't support it anyway. So we have all these attacks on the book of Genesis, which tells us this is an important book. So it's good that we know at least chapter 1. And the goal that I have is to try to give you as much information about chapter 1 as you can handle. Hopefully today it won't be too technical. Let me give you some background. When Moses was writing, and when the book of Genesis was composed, I believe it was probably the first book that Moses composed. He was where, obviously? It was probably sometime around the time of the Exodus. Now, no one knows exactly because the book doesn't give us a specific indication of the date of the writing of the book of Genesis. Personally, I think it was somewhere very early around the time frame of the Exodus itself. Maybe before, and most certainly very shortly afterwards. What was the situation of not only Moses, but the children of Israel? Where were they?
In the wilderness.
Well, first they were in Egypt. So that entire generation grew up in Egypt, right? Including Moses. And then they were in the wilderness, but they were in Egypt. So they were exposed to the Egyptians. Now, ultimately, where was God going to send them? Now, it took a while. It took a few years. Canaan. Okay. Well, Moses, I think, was Egyptian by birth. Well, not Egyptian, but he was raised in an Egyptian culture. He was well educated, so he knew the world of his day. He knew what Canaan was all about. Now, he probably didn't understand everything that God had in mind for the children of Israel, but he did have some idea of the Canaanites. He also knew of other cultures. And I think he writes this book in that context. And some of the things that we'll see in Genesis 1 reflect that mindset. So you want to keep that in the back of your thinking. And let me give you some more background on that. So the occasion of the writing of the book of Genesis is the occasion of the Exodus. And that time frame, and that generation came out of Egypt. And now they're going to face other neighbors that have other unbiblical ideas. And Moses wants to prepare them, and the book of Genesis is part of that preparation. It also included the other 4 books of the Pentateuch. So it's not surprising that some of the information that we find, and even the structure of some of what we find in the book of Genesis, is similar to other ancient Near Eastern literature. Now, the issue comes up, well, did Moses borrow from them? Because it's well known, for example, there's a creation account of the Babylonians, but it's well known that that one came before the writings of Moses. So did Moses pull out from them information in order to compose Genesis chapter 1? Or what's going on there? But at least we know the similarity not only is in structure, but also in language and some of the concepts, but it also is very dissimilar as well. In fact, the dissimilarities are greater. The neighborhood, let's take a look at the neighborhood. the background. In other words, where did they come out of? They came out of Egypt. So what were they raised with? Well, they were raised in terms of a concept of God. There was Isis, the Egyptian god or goddess, which has a relationship to throne or authority or power. And you probably are aware that many of the Egyptian gods were in the form of animals. And the Egyptians had a concept that gods inhabited animals or objects. There were some cosmic gods as well. This is where they came from. Now, I mention this because we're going to see some things in the book of Genesis that kind of reveal that this is the background that Moses comes from. And he's really arguing against some of these ideas because they're false ideas and unbiblical. They're going to Canaan. I hope I don't lose my voice here. The Canaanites had El, who was represented by a bull, Baal, who was considered Lord, another god by the name of Dagon. So all of these false gods. Now, they all had a few things in common. One thing they had in common was all of these were related to nature in some way. Moses was probably aware from history of the Sumerians. They had Utu, who was the sun god. Nana was the moon god. There was also gods of stars and other gods. There were also the Assyrio-Babylonian gods. Anu was the god of the heavens. Enlil was the god of order. As you can see, they're all related in some way to the creation, to that is contained in the book of Genesis. And we also find that the Babylonians had a creation account. It's called Enuma Elish. And there are some parallels and there are some similarities between what we have in the book of Genesis and Enuma Elish. In fact, there are striking parallels. But the parallels, if you study them carefully, are of the nature where Moses is saying, this is not correct, this is correct. And what we have is a correction of some of what we find in the culture or the neighborhood that the Jewish people would ultimately end up. So these are the neighbors. Now there's also the Gilgamesh epic from the Babylonians, which is the Babylonian flood account. And again, there's some striking similarities as well. Now, there's a lot of ways of explaining the similarities. I think there's a consciousness in mankind that persists in these myths and legends that point to a historical and a real event of the creation as well as a real event of the Genesis flood. Now, these are corrupted accounts, and what Moses is going to give us under inspiration, he's going to give us the accurate account through God himself. But I mention this because not only the parallels, but because I think in the book of Genesis we find a polemic. And I'll get to that in a moment. So in these ancient Near Eastern gods, they're all related to the creation. God is personified in nature in these different gods and in different ways, whether they be animals or whether they be in human form or whether they be cosmic in terms of the sun and the moon and the stars. And they are interrelated. In other words, all the gods kind of work together depending on the culture. And in fact, there's some similarities between the cultures in some of the gods. And they're also in conflict. You have gods fighting other gods. In fact, the creation account was created as a result of a conflict, a battle amongst the gods. And part of the creation is the result of the blood that was spilled in that battle. So there are some strange things in some of those myths. And these myths were very important to these people. They persisted because they were reenactments of the stories. And the idea was we reenact these things, we celebrate these things in order to sustain life, in order to sustain order, in order to sustain ourselves as a culture. So life and order dependent on these ritual celebrations that went on year after year at certain times in the calendar of all of these peoples. So that's kind of the background. And Moses is writing to a people who are going into that neighborhood and have come out of a neighborhood that these are the ideas that all of these cultures had in common. The gods were different, and some of the specifics were different, but in general, they were all somehow related to the creation. So Genesis 1 is a polemic. Well, we can explain the similarities in that universal consciousness, and there's a lot of dissimilarities, and in the dissimilarities we see this polemic or this apologetic for God. This is what really happened. And just by way of some examples that we will find as we work our way through Genesis, and some of them even this evening, instead of God being a part of nature or manifested through nature or in conflict with nature or somehow related to nature, Moses says, no, God is transcendent. In the beginning, God. Before there's a creation, God is there. So God is transcendent and God is eternal. From the very first statement that we come to in the book of Genesis. And I think what Moses is doing is he's not only preparing the children of Israel because they will have contact with these people, but he's also counteracting the theology that they were raised in that Egyptian culture. Secondly, and these are just a few examples, God is the creator of all. It's not these gods that are in conflict. It's not the god of Baal, or it's not the Babylonian god that's pictured in the Gilgamesh epic, but God. The God that enters into covenant, which will be explained later in the book of Genesis, the God that will pull them out of bondage, out of the Egyptian bondage, he is the creator of all things. There's no primordial battle because God is going to be sovereign over all of that. And that's going to be an underlying theme of all of Genesis chapter 1. So God is creator, no primordial battle, because God has no rival. God is all powerful. He speaks, things come about. There's not as a result of a death and blood spilt and creation comes about. He speaks and it comes about. There's no primordial battle. The sun and the moon and the stars, they're only lamps. They're for seasons. And God created them. They're part of his order. They're part of what he instituted. They're not gods. They're only lamps. The dragons, which was a common theme, in fact, Leviathan and dragons and some of the other references in the Old Testament, that has a mythological background, and in the Bible, sometimes they're presented in order to counteract these pagan ideas. And one of the specific creatures that's mentioned in Genesis chapter 1 is what?
Behemoth.
Is what? No, not behemoth. It's the what? No.
Great sea creatures?
The great sea creature in verse 21. And that's one of the only ones that's specifically mentioned. And I think it's mentioned because this theme of dragons or large beasts are so prominent in all of these myths. And that first creature or that dragon was good. God said it is good at the end of Genesis chapter 1. Now something happened later, but in its creation, it's created as a creature that is declared good. Natural forces are controlled, not by the gods, but God is sovereign over them, and that leads to the seventh thing, God is sovereign over all. So you don't have to reenact these rituals to gain favor and to preserve order, because the God who created everything is the one that is sovereign over all things. That's the neighborhood, that's the peoples that would surround the children of Israel. And those are the peoples in the Egyptian form that the children of Israel came out of. And now Moses writes to give them God's perspective.